As every runner knows, there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad gear. So as the leaves start to change and runners start to switch it up, given that their races may be done for the fall, they start to look at different kinds of footwear. And what comes up often is the question between what's the difference between road running shoes and trail running shoes, and should I bother getting a pair of trail running shoes? Well, while they may look the same, there's often a lot of technical differences and design differences between the two. And I think it's important to look at and consider these very carefully, road versus trail. So to start with, it's important to understand that there are differences across different models, different brands, and different styles of shoes, and none of these differences may necessarily apply to all styles. But between the outsole, between the midsole, and between the upper, there are typically differences that are common across many different models between road and trail. Let's take a look at what some of those might be. To start with, when you're looking at road shoes versus trail shoes, the most obvious difference is on the outsole itself. You typically see on a road shoe something like this, as little rubber as possible, and that rubber is usually typically as flat as possible, so you get good traction and good ground control. That 4 or 5 millimeters of rubber is usually relatively consistent and even throughout the bottom of the shoe. On a trail shoe, however, you're going to see lugs like this. But what's more important is not only the amount of rubber that you see here, but also the design and the construction of those lugs and the material itself. So on a trail shoe, what you'll typically find is actually asymmetrically designed traction. That is, in the forefoot versus the heel, you get a different kind of directionality to the lugs. So your lugs will usually point back in the forefoot and point forward in the heel. You can see it here. These lugs point this way, these lugs point this way. The thinking behind this is that as you're going forward, you're going to use mostly the forefoot and those soft surfaces, whether it's snow, whether it's dirt, whether it's gravel, and that's going to give you the most traction. And if you go downhill, that's where you want the lugs to kind of bite in the heel. And that's why the opposite direction is usually designed into that lug pattern. You may also find in some shoes an extended rubber part called a heel outrigger over here that actually, again, gives you more traction as you're going downhill. So this feature right here will give you a little bit more control when you're going down an uneven surface. Additionally, as I mentioned, the material itself may be different. If you're running on road, obviously it's a hard surface and usually you want a softer rubber. If you're running on trail, it's usually a softer surface and usually you want a harder rubber to kind of dig in. Again, there are exceptions depending on the design and the material spec itself. Another feature that you'll have also typically different between a road shoe and a trail shoe is something called a rock plate. Now that is usually a hard material between the midsole and the outsole, usually close to the rubber, that may be in the forefoot or maybe across the length of a shoe like this. And it's usually a TPU or possibly even carbon fiber. Nike's just come out with a shoe that uses the plate from the Zoom Fly on a trail running shoe. And the idea here is that this hard plate actually provides a puncture resistant or a more stable platform. As you're running across different rocks and different pointy surfaces, you don't want to get bruises on the bottom of your feet. Looking at the midsole itself, obviously you may have a difference in design. Usually the midsole of a trail shoe can be a lot beefier, so you actually get a lot more material, something kind of like this, again, to cushion all those hard surfaces that you're running over, the sticks, the rocks, and stuff like that, compared to a road shoe. You may also get, again, a softer compound to kind of absorb some of those different mixes of material and surfaces compared to a road shoe when you're running on a relatively flat surface. Looking at the upper, you'll also typically find a lot of differences. The first to consider is actually the construction and the materials of the upper itself. While you sometimes get something like this, which is a Gore-Tex construction, this is not the same as a DWR construction, but the concept behind them is both the same. A Gore-Tex construction is usually a full booty, and what that means is that this entire upper and the material used from the insole board to the upper is actually bonded from a sealing tape all the way around. What that gives you is actually a completely full waterproof upper. So all of the material is waterproof. Contrast that to a shoe like this, where you actually have a DWR material that may be slightly water resistant. DWR stands for durable water resistant, but the actual construction itself is just replacing this material for one like this that's obviously not waterproof. So you get more waterproof from splashes, but obviously if you're wading in a puddle, there's going to be holes from the stitching and at some of the seams from the upper material itself. So from outsole to midsole to upper, you obviously have lots of different design and material differences. But through the design itself, there's also big differences as well. So when you look at the design of a running shoe, for example, compared to a trail shoe, you'll have differences in terms of where you're going to want to place some of those materials that I spoke about. On a trail shoe, you'll typically have an extended toe cap, usually a higher abrasion resistant kind of material. You're going to have maybe a piece of material that goes along the top line of the midsole, again, to aid in some of that water resistance, and maybe a more coverage on the heel cap or heel counter. Your eye stay construction and tongue construction may also be different. What you may typically have in a running shoe versus a trail running shoe versus a road running shoe is actually what's called a gusset construction. So the tongue itself may be either one piece or may have an additional part inside that joins it to, again, create some of that water resistance, or may alternately be made with actually a full kind of sock construction. So again, you get less material inside. Again, another example is this shoe here. So all that in mind, there's also, of course, different details. You may have different kinds of 3M materials. You may have different kinds of meshes used. You may have different kinds of more beefier laces used and different kind of lace closures. But all that being said, a road shoe and a trail shoe, as mentioned, may look the same, but are often quite different. What's most important, however, is you keep in mind that there is a difference between a water-resistant shoe, something like this, that's not designed to be a trail shoe or a winter shoe. And you can tell that usually looking at the grip. I made the mistake of running in these once, and they were great and warm and my feet were dry, but I almost killed myself because there's virtually no grip on the bottom whatsoever. So all that being said, keep in mind whatever shoes you do choose the right one for the materials, and keep in mind the design as you're choosing those. Thanks.